Chapter 1. A Bell at Dusk. The September afternoon had slipped quietly into evening over Rosehill, leaving a lavender haze on the fields beyond the churchyard. From her cottage window, Miss Marple paused in her knitting to watch the swallows cutting sharp, playful lines through the mellow light. A faint breeze ruffled the hollyhocks by her gate and carried the faint, resinous scent of a bonfire somewhere along the lane. Rosehill, with its neat Georgian houses and crooked thatched cottages, had always seemed a place beyond the reach of violence. Even its scandals, a curate's romance, a gardener's petty theft, were of the mildest order. That was why the faint, unexpected clang of the bell from St. Ethelrida's tower felt oddly disturbing as it floated across the hedgerows. It was not Sunday, nor was any service scheduled. The bell tolled once, then again, as though an unpracticed hand had tugged the rope. After a moment the sound ceased, leaving an uncanny hush in its wake. Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and reached for the shawl folded neatly over the back of her chair. She had lived long enough to know that oddities in small villages were seldom without meaning. With the soft tread of someone accustomed to quiet observation, she crossed her garden path and set out toward the square. Shadows lengthened along the lane. Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, stood at her shop door, squinting toward the church. "Did you hear it, Miss Marple?" she called, voice edged with curiosity. "I did," said Miss Marple mildly. "Most peculiar." Two boys pedaled past, their bicycles rattling over the cobbles, eager to discover the source of the sound. At the lich gate they dismounted, peering up at the gray tower silhouetted against the fading sky. Its narrow lancet windows showed no movement. The churchyard itself lay serene, the gravestones washed in lilac dusk. Yet something felt amiss. A figure was crossing from the vestry porch, the verger, Mr. Ellison, looking flustered, a large iron key clutched in his hand. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "Apologies for the disturbance. Must have been the wind knocking the bell rope." Miss Marple inclined her head but said nothing. She knew well that ropes, however mischievous the breeze, seldom tug themselves twice with such measured insistence. As she walked slowly homeward, she noted the restless chatter already spreading through the square. Mr. Ellison conferring with Mrs. Finch, a couple of villagers pausing on their way to the pub. By bedtime, she thought, Rosehill would have a dozen explanations, none of them likely to be true. Back at her cottage, she closed the door against the cool night and set her teapot on the hob. Yet the echo of that solitary bell clung to her mind. There was, she felt, an undercurrent in the air, a faint tremor that spoke of something waiting to be uncovered. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully, her blue eyes bright behind their spectacles. Long experience told her that disturbances, however slight, often heralded darker matters to come. Outside, the bell tower loomed pale beneath the rising moon, silent now, but no less watchful. Chapter 2. The Body in the Belfry. Morning sunlight spilled across Rosehill's neat square, gilding the cobbles and turning the church's weathered stone a warm honeygold. Birds quarreled cheerfully in the yews, and the village appeared, at first glance, entirely at peace. But as Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage with a basket on her arm, she felt a subtle unease hanging in the clear air, as though the quiet itself had grown too deliberate. Her walk toward St. Ethelrida's was an old habit. She often liked to greet the day with a few minutes among the flowers of the churchyard. Today, however, a cluster of figures by the porch hinted that something unusual awaited. Mrs. Finch stood at the center, a hand pressed to her ample bosom, while Mr. Ellison, the verger, hovered near the door, his complexion a shade too pale for comfort. "What's amiss?" Miss Marple asked gently as she joined them. Mr. Ellison gave a jerky bow. "It's best you don't come inside, ma'am." His voice trembled despite his effort at composure. "Found a man there. In the belfry stairwell." Mrs. Finch leaned closer, lowering her voice to an urgent whisper. "Dead, Miss Marple. Quite dead." Miss Marple inclined her head, eyes thoughtful behind her spectacles. She had expected, after the bell's odd tolling the night before, that some explanation must follow. But she had not foreseen this. Inspector Crayford arrived soon after, his polished boots scattering dew from the grass. A large, steady man with a genial face, he nonetheless projected the brisk assurance of someone accustomed to command. He listened to Mr. Ellison's account, then beckoned Miss Marple a respectful step aside. "You were nearby yesterday evening, I believe?" he asked. "I was at my window when I heard the bell," she replied calmly. "Twice, with a pause between." The inspector nodded and moved inside, signaling that no one else should follow. Yet the village, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and dismay, lingered at the churchyard gate, whispering behind gloved hands. When Crayford re-emerged, his expression was grave. A man about 40. Respectable clothes, London make, but no papers or wallet. A nasty bruise on the head. Could have fallen from the stair. He surveyed the ring of faces. "We'll need to keep the tower closed until our men finish the search." Miss Marple did not intrude on his work. Instead, she strolled quietly round to the south side of the church, letting her eyes wander over the grass where footprints might remain in the dew. A faint track led from the lich gate toward the vestry door, not the clear tread of a villager's boots, but broader, as if made by a man and used to country paths. Close by, a sprig of ivy lay crushed near the foundation stones. She bent delicately, noting a smudge of reddish earth upon it, quite unlike the darker soil of the churchyard itself. She stored the observation away with others, the strained note in Mr. Ellison's voice, the absence of identification, and lingering on the air inside the porch a faint foreign-smelling tobacco. By mid-morning, the square hummed with speculation. Some swore the stranger must be a burglar surprised by the bell rope. Others muttered of jealous husbands or smugglers from the coast. Children darted in and out of the gathering with wide, excited eyes, until shooed home for lessons. Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage for tea, declining several invitations to join the discussions. She preferred quiet reflection to noisy conjecture. Seated once more by her window, she gazed toward the bell tower rising above the roofs. The morning sun burnished its leaded panes, but the shadow at its base seemed longer than it should have been. She sipped slowly, her face serene. Only her eyes betrayed the alertness behind that calm exterior. However tragic, deaths in villages seldom occurred without a story, and stories, she knew, were built from very human motives. Outside, a breeze stirred the roses along the wall, carrying with it the faint echo of a bell that had not rung since last night. Chapter 3. Whispers in Rosehill. By the time the church clock struck 3, Rosehill had become a village alive with speculation. Curtains trembled as faces appeared and disappeared behind lace. Front gates stood half open where neighbors leaned together, voices lowered though no one could resist being overheard. The stranger in the belfry had given everyone a thrilling story, and stories, Miss Marple knew, rarely stayed tidy for long. She tied on a soft felt hat and walked down the lane toward the post office. The afternoon sunlight made the cobbles glow, but there was an edge of tension in the air, like a string drawn too tightly. Mrs. Finch was polishing the brass letter slot when she saw Miss Marple and bustled inside at once, eager to be the first to impart new details. "Terrible business, isn't it?" she began, sliding a sheet of stamps across the counter. "The inspector says the man wasn't local at all. London boots, he reckons. Clean-shaven but not lately barbered. And nothing on him but a handkerchief." She tapped her nose. "Very strange." Miss Marple smiled politely, slipping the stamps into her reticule. "Indeed. And how is Mr. Ellison today?" "White as a sheet, poor lamb. Says he keeps hearing the bell in his head." Mrs. Finch leaned forward conspiratorially. "Mind you, he was in the tower himself last evening, checking the rope, so he claims. Odd time for it, don't you think?" A small brass bell jingled as the door opened. Mrs. Crampton, the vicar's wife, entered in a flurry of muslin and nerves. "Have you heard?" she asked before either could greet her. "I saw someone last night, tall, rather thin, standing by the yews when I went to fetch my umbrella from the vestry. Not a face I knew." She shivered. "When the bell rang, I thought perhaps he'd been locked in by mistake." Miss Marple listened, eyes steady on Mrs. Crampton's fluttering hands. "How very unsettling. Did you notice anything else?" "A coat, perhaps." "A dark one, yes. Longish. But I hurried off. I'd promised the vicar I'd put the hymn sheets in order." Later, on the way home, Miss Marple detoured to the Green Hart Inn. The low-ceilinged taproom buzzed with voices. Mr. Pritchard, the carpenter, was declaring that the dead man had surely been a jewel thief. Mrs. Dawlish, clutching a sherry glass, thought it was a crime of passion. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively near the hearth, sipping a modest lemonade and letting the talk wash over her like tidewater on shingle. Her gaze drifted toward the back corner, where Lily Ellison, the verger's niece, stood apart from the crowd. Lily's face was pale beneath her fair hair, and she twisted her gloves in nervous fingers before slipping out through the side door. Miss Marple noted the girl's hasty exit and the way Mr. Ellison's eyes flicked after her, troubled. As the evening deepened, Inspector Crayford arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. He stood awkwardly on the threshold, hat in hand, his expression a blend of courtesy and faint frustration. "I wondered if you'd seen or heard anything else, ma'am," he said. "We've men tracing the stranger's movements, but so far, nothing." Miss Marple invited him to sit, offering tea. "I fear I can add little," she said mildly, "beyond what I mentioned this morning. Though perhaps—" She paused, stirring sugar into his cup. "Perhaps you might consider that people sometimes take journeys for reasons they would rather not confess." The inspector gave a dry chuckle. "In my line, that's nearly always the case." When he had gone, Miss Marple sat a while before the hearth, hands folded over her knitting. The fire crackled softly, throwing patterns of gold and shadow across the room. Out in the square, lamps gleamed in cottage windows, bright little secrets against the night. She thought of the man in the tower, of the scuffed ivy and foreign tobacco, of Lily's anxious face and Mrs. Crampton's unknown watcher. Threads, all of them, and if she were patient, the pattern would show itself. For the moment, she merely smiled and set another stitch upon her needles, letting the village's whispers murmur beyond her window. Chapter 4. Shadows by the Tower. By Thursday morning the September mist lay thick over Rosehill, softening the edges of roofs and hedges so that the village seemed to hover in a half-forgotten dream. Miss Marple, fastening her garden cloak against the damp, stepped outside with her secateur, intending to clip the last of the late roses. Yet her attention strayed at once to St. Ethelrida's, whose tower loomed faintly through the vapor. Even muffled in fog, its presence was insistent, a silent witness. At the churchyard gate stood Lily Ellison, pale as the stones around her. She started when she saw Miss Marple, then attempted a smile that wavered like a candle in draught. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said with warmth. "Out early." "I couldn't sleep," Lily admitted. Her hands worried the strap of a worn leather satchel. "Uncle sent me to fetch some papers from the vestry, but—" She hesitated, eyes sliding toward the tower. "I don't like it in there. Not since—" "Well." Miss Marple's glance followed hers to the dim outline of the belfry door. "Quite understandable," she murmured. "A church should offer peace, not unease." Lily looked as if she might say more, but Mr. Ellison himself appeared from the porch, keys jingling at his belt. "Off with you, Lily," he said too sharply. "I'll see to the papers." The girl obeyed at once, vanishing through the gate. Miss Marple noticed how tightly the verger gripped the handle of his key ring, and how carefully he avoided meeting her eyes. Later that morning Inspector Crayford held an informal interview at the vicarage. Gathered there were the vicar and his wife, Mr. Ellison, Mrs. Finch, and Mr. Pritchard, those most closely connected to the church and its surroundings. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the hearth, appeared to be absorbed in the pattern of the rug. Crayford's questions were methodical. Who had last seen the tower door unlocked, who might have heard footsteps the previous evening, whether anyone recognized the dead man. Replies were hesitant, overlapping. Mrs. Crampton, the vicar's wife, repeated her sighting of the tall figure by the yews, adding that she had felt a dreadful impression, quite chilling. Mr. Ellison claimed to have been polishing brass in the vestry until nearly dusk, after which he had gone home alone. Miss Marple watched the verger's nervous hands. They smoothed his cassock though no wrinkle was there. She also noted the brief, guilty flicker in Mrs. Crampton's eyes when her husband spoke of locking the side gate. Something in her manner suggested an omission. When the meeting ended, Crayford walked with Miss Marple through the fog-bound square. "You don't credit an accident, do you?" he asked with a half-smile. "I seldom find that accidents arrange themselves so theatrically," she replied. "Still, I should hate to form a conclusion prematurely." At luncheon, Miss Marple entertained her nephew Raymond and his wife, Joan, who were motoring through from London. Their lively talk of publishers and plays might have distracted a less disciplined listener, but Miss Marple's thoughts kept circling the stranger's death. She tucked away an observation Raymond made quite idly, that the road into Rosehill had been surprisingly busy the previous evening, with several cars stopped at the bend near the mill stream. That afternoon the fog began to lift, revealing a pale, washed sky. Miss Marple walked once more to the churchyard, her small figure neat against the greening stones. She stood for a long while by the tower steps, examining the worn threshold and the faint scrape on its lower edge, as though something heavy had been dragged or dropped there. She turned at a sound, Lily Ellison lingering by the yews, watching her anxiously. Their eyes met, and the girl's lips parted as if to speak. Then she seemed to think better of it and fled toward the village street. Miss Marple sighed, gazing up at the bell tower, whose weathered walls caught the thin light. A bell rope, a body, an unnamed man, and somewhere a motive quiet but persistent, as patient as herself. Chapter 5. Tea, Tracks, and Quiet Questions. A pale sun peered over the thatched roofs of Rosehill the next morning, throwing a modest brightness across the square. Miss Marple, shawl neatly pinned, was already arranging scones on a china plate when Inspector Crayford knocked. He looked slightly winded, as though the walk from the Green Hart had been longer than expected. "Hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple," he said, stepping into the cozy parlor. "Thought I'd take you up on that offer of tea." "Not at all, Inspector." She poured with practiced ease, the delicate clink of cup and saucer soothing against the hush of the room. "Milk, no sugar, I believe?" "Quite right." Crayford accepted the cup with a faint smile, then leaned forward. "I've been over the churchyard again. There are faint marks on the path behind the vestry, boot prints, wider than most round here. And something else, a thin groove as if a stick or umbrella had been dragged." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she listened. "Interesting," she murmured. "Did you notice if the groove led toward the tower or away?" "Toward," he said. "And I'd wager the prints belong to the fellow we found. But we still don't know how or why he ended up there." Miss Marple regarded him over her spectacles. "Sometimes, Inspector, the why is less complicated than the means of arriving. People come to villages for all sorts of reasons. Love, shame, revenge, even curiosity." She set her knitting aside and offered another scone. "I fancy this man's purpose will prove less simple than a stumble on the stairs." Later that day, she walked to the vicarage under an unsettled sky. Mrs. Crampton was arranging dahlias in a blue jug, her manner brisk yet distracted. She welcomed Miss Marple with a flurry of apologies and ushered her into the drawing-room, where sunlight lay pale on polished tables. "I hardly slept last night," Mrs. Crampton confessed. "That man in the church, I keep seeing him lying there. And there's the other thing, of course." "What other thing, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. The vicar's wife hesitated, fingers tightening around the stem of a dahlia. I may have heard voices by the yews on Tuesday evening. Low voices, arguing. I thought it was just some village lads, but now I wonder." Miss Marple tucked the remark away with calm appreciation. "A most valuable recollection," she said, rising to admire the flowers. "Sometimes a memory only ripens when given a little time." As she left the vicarage, a movement near the lich gate caught her eye. Lily Ellison again, crouched by the hedge as though searching for something. When she saw Miss Marple, she flushed and straightened, clutching an envelope to her chest. Without a word, she hurried off toward the lane. That afternoon Miss Marple visited the Green Hart for a quiet lemonade. The inn was less boisterous than the previous day, though a knot of villagers still debated theories by the fireplace. Mr. Pritchard was adamant that the stranger must have been part of a gang of thieves. Mrs. Dawlish favored a story of clandestine lovers meeting under the bell tower. Miss Marple listened, noting who spoke with too much relish and who stayed unusually silent. Back home, as twilight crept across the garden, she sorted through her thoughts like skeins of wool. A bell rung at dusk, a dead man without a name, Lily's nervousness, Mr. Ellison's guarded answers, voices near the yews. Threads, waiting for the right hand to weave them. She lit the lamp and drew the curtains against the encroaching dark. The kettle sang softly, and beyond the window the tower stood outlined against a sky turning violet. Miss Marple, serene and intent, picked up her knitting once more, a small, familiar act that steadied the mind while the heart prepared to follow the faintest of clues. Chapter 6. Echoes on the Lane. The rain that had threatened all morning finally arrived just after luncheon, sweeping across Rosehill in a fine silver curtain. By 3 o'clock the village smelled of wet earth and chimney smoke, and the cobbles shone like onyx beneath puddled light. Miss Marple, peering out from her parlor window, judged it an opportune moment to pay a call or two. Some people, she knew, were more inclined to talk when kept indoors by bad weather. Her first stop was at the Green Hart Inn. The taproom was quieter than usual. Only Mr. Pritchard nursed an ale by the hearth, and the landlord, Mr. Brewer, was polishing tankards behind the bar. Both greeted her with the kind of polite curiosity reserved for someone who might be gently prizing information from them. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," Brewer said. "Miserable weather, eh?" "It does have its uses," she replied with a smile. "Keeps one at home, or indeed here." She accepted a modest glass of ginger wine and settled by the fire. "I wonder," she said lightly, "whether either of you happened to notice anyone passing along the lane near the church on Tuesday evening?" Mr. Pritchard rubbed his chin. "Can't say I did. Though," he glanced at Brewer, who nodded encouragingly. "There was a motor car stopped just beyond the mill bend that night. Dark saloon, single headlamp out. I thought maybe someone'd broken down." Miss Marple tucked the detail away. "And did you see the driver?" "No, ma'am. Too misty." After a few more mild inquiries she left the inn and walked slowly up the lane, umbrella aloft. The rain had eased into a fine drizzle, blurring the outline of the church tower. Near the lich gate she paused, stooping to examine a faint depression in the wet gravel, tire marks, not quite washed away. They curved toward the track behind the vestry. She was still studying them when Lily Ellison emerged from behind the hedge, clutching a small parcel. The girl started violently at sight of her, then attempted composure. "Oh, I didn't see you there, Miss Marple." "No harm done, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "A tiresome afternoon to be out, isn't it? Running errands for your uncle." Lily hesitated, hugging the parcel closer. "Just posting a letter," she murmured, eyes sliding away. Miss Marple let the moment pass, merely nodding. "Take care on the whetstones." As the girl hurried off toward the square, Miss Marple noted the smudge of damp earth along the hem of her skirt, fresh, as if from the path by the vestry door. Back at the cottage she found Inspector Crayford waiting, hat dripping onto her mat. He accepted a towel and sat by the fire while she prepared tea. "We've traced a railway ticket in the dead man's pocket lining," he reported. "Single, from London to Braxton Junction. Dated Tuesday. Beyond that, nothing. No luggage in the cloakroom. No one remembers him." Miss Marple poured milk into his cup. "A single ticket is a lonely sort of thing," she observed. "People who buy them rarely plan to return." Crayford studied her, half amused. "You're thinking he meant trouble?" "I'm thinking," she said, stirring gently, "that journeys begun in secrecy often end unhappily." When he had gone, dusk had gathered around the cottage, softening the edges of furniture and pictures. Miss Marple drew the curtains, then sat with her knitting at the small table. The bell tower stood dark against a clearing sky, its stones still wet with rain. She watched it for a long moment, calm and intent, as though listening for an echo only she could hear. Chapter 7. Conversations at Dusk. By Friday the weather had cleared, leaving Rosehill freshly washed and shining beneath a pale sun. The scent of wet grass drifted through Miss Marple's open window as she tidied away her breakfast tray. She had spent much of the night considering the narrow groove beside the belfry path, the saloon car near the mill bend, and Lily Ellison's curious movements. All were threads, slender but suggestive. She set off after luncheon, a sprig of lavender pinned neatly to her jacket. The village square was alive with small tasks, Mrs. Dawlish airing cushions on her step, 2 lads mending a puncture by the pump, Mr. Ellison carting him books from the vestry to the porch. Miss Marple paused by him, her tone as mild as sunshine. "A busy day, Mr. Ellison?" He started slightly, then forced a smile. "Just keeping things in order, Miss Marple." Can't let tragedy put the parish behind. You are quite right, she said, watching as he stacked the books with rather more force than needed. I hope Lily is bearing up. She's unsettled. His eyes flicked towards the lich-gate. Best she keeps out of it. Miss Marple nodded, but her gaze followed the direction of his glance. Lily stood there, half concealed by a pillar, fingers twisting the strap of her satchel. When their eyes met, the girl flushed and turned away. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the edge of the village, where hedgerows opened onto the Braxton Road. The breeze was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of wet leaves. At a small lay-by near the mill, she found faint tracks pressed into the soft verge, the tread of tires half dried in the sun. She bent to examine them, noting how one side was deeper, as if a car had paused before turning back. A voice behind her made her straighten. Inspector Crayford approached, hat in hand. I thought I might find you here, he said with a wry look. You've a knack for being where the evidence hides. I find a walk clears the mind, Inspector, Miss Marple replied serenely. And sometimes the road keeps its own diary. He chuckled, then grew serious. We've had word from London. There's a suggestion our man may have been connected to an insurance firm, and to a case involving a considerable sum gone astray. He glanced toward the village roofs glinting in the distance. If that's true, someone here might have had reason to wish him silent. Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on the lane. Money is often a motive, she said, though not the only one. Affection, or its opposite, can be just as persuasive. Evening shadows stretched long across the cobbles when Miss Marple returned. Passing the church, she paused to look up at the bell tower, its stone mellow in the last light. Lily was there again, seated on the low wall, a sealed envelope clutched in both hands. For a moment the girl seemed on the point of speaking, but instead she rose abruptly and hurried toward the post office. Miss Marple watched her go, then turned homeward, a faint furrow between her brows. The pattern was still veiled, but its shape was becoming discernible. A man from London, a bell rung at dusk, a secret troubling the verger and his niece. She sensed that soon, very soon, the truth would begin to press its face against the glass of village calm. Inside, she set a lamp on the table and picked up her knitting, fingers steady though her thoughts ran swift. Outside, the last swallows circled the tower, dark strokes against a sky fading to rose. Chapter 8. A second disturbance. Saturday dawned bright and sharp, with a promise of early autumn in the cool air. Rosehill looked so peaceful that morning, as though nothing wicked could possibly lurk among its tidy hedges and whitewashed cottages. Yet Miss Marple, tying on her garden hat, felt that same quiet tension threading through the village, the way a hairline crack runs beneath polished enamel. By mid-morning the calm was broken. Word came up the lane that someone had been taken ill near the churchyard. When Miss Marple arrived, she found a small group gathered just inside the lich-gate. Mrs. Finch clutching her apron, the vicar hovering anxiously, and Lily Ellison kneeling on the grass beside a young man. It was Mr. Brewer, the landlord of the Green Hart. His face was ashen, beads of sweat clinging to his brow. Felt queer. All of a sudden, he muttered. Lily held a mug of water to his lips, but he waved it off with a trembling hand. Inspector Crayford appeared moments later, striding across the graves with purposeful calm. He knelt, examined Brewer's pulse, then glanced at the crushed grass nearby. Best get him indoors, he said. I'll send for the doctor. The little procession made its way to the inn, where the publican was settled into an armchair by the fire. Dr. Haslam soon arrived, his satchel thumping onto the table. After a short examination, he straightened, frowning. Not an apoplexy, he murmured. Could be something he ate or drank. His eyes flicked toward the shelves behind the bar. Brewer roused enough to speak. Only a nip of my own cider, he said hoarsely. 'Twas after I came back from the churchyard. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the settle, noted the doctor's slight shrug. Poisoning? She asked mildly. Nothing definite, Haslam replied. But I'd advise he rest and we'll see how he fares. While the others discussed arrangements, Miss Marple slipped out to the yard behind the inn. There, near the empty cider barrels, she saw a muddy heel print leading toward the wicket gate, fresh and larger than Brewer's boot. She bent and touched the edge. Still damp. On her way back across the square, she stopped at the post office for a few letters. Mrs. Finch was full of indignation and conjecture. "Mark my words, Miss Marple, this isn't the end of it. First the poor gentleman in the tower, and now Mr. Brewer near fit to drop. There's mischief afoot." Miss Marple agreed only with a polite murmur. Inside, her thoughts were anything but calm. Two incidents, close together, in a village where little ever happened, except perhaps when someone wanted it hidden. That evening, as twilight gathered across the meadows, Miss Marple walked once more to St. Ethelrida's. The tower caught the fading light, solemn and still. Yet as she paused beneath it she felt, quite clearly, that the quiet stones were holding their breath, waiting, as she was, for the truth to step into view. She turned homeward through the hush of approaching night, knitting already tucked beneath her arm. The first stars pricked out above the roofs, and a single owl called from the hedgerow, mournful and insistent. Chapter 9. Lines begin to cross. Sunday morning broke clear and pale, the sky a soft blue behind drifting mist. Church bells from neighboring parishes carried faintly across the fields, but St. Ethelrida's itself stood silent, its own bell rope sealed off and the tower locked at Inspector Crayford's order. Miss Marple, shawl wrapped against a brisk breeze, slipped into her seat near the back pew for morning service. She noticed how the congregation seemed divided, half intent on their hymnals, half stealing glances at the shadowed arch that led up toward the belfry. Afterward, on the church steps, conversation sprang up like dandelions after rain. Mr. Pritchard declared it a disgrace that the police still hadn't named the fellow in the tower. Mrs. Dawlish insisted she'd heard the dead man was a detective come to expose some scandal in Rosehill. Lily Ellison lingered near the porch, clutching her prayer book and looking as though she longed to speak yet feared to. Her uncle kept close watch, ushering her briskly down the path. Miss Marple returned home for a quiet luncheon, but her thoughts were far from tranquil. She laid out her notebook, an unassuming little volume bound in faded blue cloth, and began to arrange her observations. The London ticket to Braxton, purchased the very day of the murder. Tire tracks near the mill bend. One headlamp missing. Lily's unease, and the way Mr. Ellison shielded her whenever the inspector's questions drew near. Brewer's sudden illness after visiting the churchyard. She closed the book with a soft click just as Inspector Crayford arrived. He accepted tea and perched on the edge of her armchair, his large hands turning the cup carefully. "We've traced the stranger," he said without preamble. "Name of Henry Calthorpe. Employed in London by an insurance office, but unofficially doing a spot of private inquiry work. Word is, he was looking into a matter of stolen securities. A tidy sum." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved with even grace. Curious that he should pursue his search to so quiet a parish. Indeed. Crayford rubbed his chin. "There's talk he'd linked the theft to someone here. We've not ruled out Ellison, or Brewer for that matter. And there's an old connection between Calthorpe's firm and a lady in Braxton, a Mrs. Markham, who rents a cottage on the far side of your village." Miss Marple looked mildly interested. Mrs. Markham. A widow with rather striking silver hair. "You know her." "I have observed her tending roses on more than one occasion," Miss Marple replied. "A woman who dislikes to be overlooked." That afternoon, Miss Marple walked out toward the lane beyond the mill. She paused by the hedge where the tire marks lingered faintly in dry mud. A few yards further lay a discarded match, charred at the tip, the sort that might have lit a cigarette. She tucked it neatly into her glove. On her way back she encountered Lily, who had strayed from the churchyard path. The girl hesitated, biting her lip. "Miss Marple," she began, voice low, Do you think the man in the tower could have been looking for someone here?" "It is quite possible, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "But people seeking others often find more than they expect." Lily's eyes brimmed with unshed words. Then she shook her head and hurried off, leaving Miss Marple to watch the retreating figure with quiet concern. As dusk settled over Rosehill, lamps winked a light in cottage windows. From her parlor, Miss Marple gazed toward the dark silhouette of the bell tower. The pattern of the puzzle was emerging: a London investigator, a theft, a village hiding more than one secret. Yet the picture was still blurred, like a photograph waiting to develop fully under steady hands. She set down her knitting and reached for her notebook once more. The case, she felt, had only just begun to speak its real language. Chapter 10. Conversations at the Green Hart. Monday brought low gray clouds and a steady wind that rattled the inn sign above the Green Hart. Miss Marple, shawl pinned securely at her shoulder, stepped inside after her morning errands. The room smelled of hearth smoke and cider apples, a comforting scent that belied the wary hush hanging over the regulars. Mr. Brewer, pale but determined to be seen upright after his fainting spell, stood behind the counter polishing glasses. A clean bandage showed above his collar where the doctor had bled him, just in case. When Miss Marple inquired after his health, he insisted he was fit as a fiddle, though the tremor in his hand suggested otherwise. The taproom slowly filled, Mrs. Finch for her midday cordial, Mr. Pritchard seeking news, and 2 farmhands warming themselves by the grate. Soon the conversation turned, as always, to the death in the tower. "Stranger from London," muttered Pritchard. "No good ever comes of them poking about country business." Mrs. Finch sniffed. "I should like to know what business that poor man had with us at all." Brewer gave an odd little cough. "Said nothing to me, he didn't. Only asked the way to St. Ethelrida's. Looked tired and worried." Miss Marple, seated with a cup of tea near the settle, glanced up mildly. "And was anyone else about at the time?" Brewer hesitated. "Well, there was Ellison, come in for a parcel. Didn't stay long." A draft swept through as the door opened, admitting Mrs. Markham in a trim gray coat. She looked around the room, eyes sharp, before crossing to the bar. "A pot of tea, if you please," she said. "And I'd be obliged for a word, Mr. Brewer, somewhere private." Miss Marple, apparently absorbed in adjusting her scarf, noted the way Brewer stiffened before leading the widow toward the parlor. Their voices, though muffled, carried a certain urgency through the paneled door. When they re-emerged, Mrs. Markham's expression was smooth, but Brewer's face had taken on a pinched look, as though he'd swallowed something unpleasant. She swept past Miss Marple with a faint nod and left at once, heading toward the Braxton Road. A few minutes later, Inspector Crayford entered, stamping rain from his boots. "Afternoon, Miss Marple." "Brewer." He accepted a mug of cider and lowered his voice. "We've found out more about Calthorpe's inquiries. He was tracing bearer bonds that vanished from a London office. Seems someone in these parts once worked there, and left suddenly." Miss Marple allowed her knitting needles to click softly. "An employee who sought the quiet of the countryside after a mistake, perhaps?" "Or after stealing a fortune," Crayford replied grimly. By late afternoon Miss Marple was on her way home along the mill lane, rain clouds lifting to reveal a pale sun. She paused at the stile where tire marks had dried into shallow grooves. From somewhere behind the hedge came a faint rustle, but when she looked, there was only a single wood pigeon flapping clumsily into the trees. At her cottage, she brewed tea and laid out her notes. Threads were beginning to converge. Brewer's secretive talk with Mrs. Markham, Ellison's unease, Lily's troubled glances, the mysterious bonds. And always at the center, Henry Calthorpe, a man who had come to Rosehill with questions and found death instead. Outside, dusk gathered once more, settling over Rosehill like a veil. Miss Marple sat very still, letting the puzzle settle in her mind. Somewhere amid the village's everyday kindness and gossip lay the key to a crime, and perhaps to more danger still. Chapter 11. A Visitor at Dusk. Tuesday's light was wan and cool, filtered through the tall elms along Rosehill's main street. Miss Marple, tending her roses in the front garden, noted with mild curiosity the rare stir in the village. Even the post office had more traffic than usual, and Mrs. Finch bustled about with an air of importance she usually reserved for weddings or funerals. By mid-afternoon, a stranger arrived, a woman elegantly dressed yet plainly traveling, who alighted from a carriage at the edge of the square. She carried a small black satchel and seemed slightly flustered by the mist settling around the cottages. Miss Marple's sharp eyes quickly identified her. Mrs. Markham, visiting sooner than expected, and certainly not for a leisurely walk. Inside the cottage, after a polite greeting, Miss Marple invited her to sit. Tea was poured, the silver tray catching the last of the weak afternoon sun. The widow's hands, delicate and restless, toyed with the cup's handle. Her voice was calm, but there was a tension beneath it that Miss Marple noted instantly. "I hear," Mrs. Markham began, "that your village has had rather an unsettling week." "Yes," Miss Marple replied evenly. "A visitor arrived, and matters have taken a regrettable turn." She paused, letting her knitting lie in her lap. "You've come unexpectedly. Perhaps you might explain your presence." Mrs. Markham's eyes flicked to the window, to the square beyond, as if measuring the distance to the bell tower. "I had reason to fear trouble might reach here," she said carefully. "The man who died, Henry Calthorpe. He was tracing a matter connected to London. I feared that secrets might be discovered here, secrets of mine." Miss Marple's fingers paused on the yarn. "Secrets are rarely hidden where people live, my dear. They echo in small actions, in nervous glances, in minor omissions. And the village is very observant." A faint blush colored the widow's cheeks. "I admit," she said softly, "that I hoped to speak with the inspector, to explain what I knew before anyone suspected me unjustly." Miss Marple's blue eyes were gentle, yet unyielding. Truth, eventually, has a way of making itself known. But for now, it is prudent to speak carefully. Even small misstatements can be misleading. The conversation turned to the village itself, Rosehill's quiet routines, the curious bell, the death of Calthorpe, and the strange illness of Mr. Brewer. Miss Marple listened more than she spoke, allowing Mrs. Markham to reveal what she wished, while storing every inflection and hesitation. By evening, as the light waned to dusky violet, Mrs. Markham left for her carriage. Miss Marple watched from her gate as the vehicle rolled down the lane, leaving behind a faint scent of lavender and powder. The widow's visit had provided clues, yet also posed questions. Her urgency, her knowledge of Calthorpe's work, and the way her presence had unnerved the village. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple brewed a pot of tea for herself, sat by the window, and reviewed the day. Lily Ellison's anxiety, Mr. Ellison's careful evasions, Brewer's fainting, and now Mrs. Markham's visit. The strands were beginning to twist together in patterns only a careful observer could discern. She looked up at the silent bell tower against the evening sky. Soon, she thought, someone's quiet truth would slip, and when it did, the whole of Rosehill would shudder with it. Chapter 12. Small Tests and Quiet Observations. Wednesday dawned crisp, with sunlight glancing off dew-laden cobbles in Rosehill. Miss Marple moved through her morning routine with her usual calm, yet her mind was alert, weaving together the threads of the past week. The stranger in the belfry, Lily Ellison's unease, Brewer's fainting, and Mrs. Markham's sudden visit all formed an intricate web. It was time to watch the villagers more closely, to observe their reactions when gently provoked. Her first visit was to Mr. Ellison, who was arranging him books in the vestry. She complimented him on his care for the church, then casually mentioned that Calthorpe had inquired about some local families before his death. The verger's hands trembled slightly, and his eyes flicked toward the lich-gate. He mumbled something about being too busy to remember. Miss Marple noted the hesitation but said nothing further, allowing the seed of unease to remain. Later, she walked to the Green Hart in under a pale autumn sun. The taproom was quiet, save for Mr. Pritchard and a farmhand discussing crops. Miss Marple mentioned, almost in passing, that someone had seen a dark saloon car near the mill bend the night before the bell tolled. Mr. Pritchard's brow furrowed, and he exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance with the farmhand. Small reactions like these were her greatest clues. The tiniest twitch or glance often spoke louder than words. In the afternoon, she returned to the post office. Mrs. Finch was busily sorting letters, humming to herself. Miss Marple commented that she had seen Lily Ellison lingering by the churchyard and seemed troubled. Mrs. Finch's hands froze mid-sort, and her eyes flicked to the clock. "Curious, isn't it?" she murmured. "How young people can worry themselves over nothing." Again, Miss Marple said nothing but stored the detail. By late afternoon, Miss Marple took her customary walk along the lane behind the village, where she examined the faint tire marks near the mill. The earth was soft from the previous day's drizzle, and she noticed new impressions, light boot prints leading toward the tower. Someone had been there recently, perhaps hoping to conceal evidence. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlor by lamplight, reviewing her notes. She considered each small reaction. Mr. Ellison's trembling hands, Pritchard's exchanged glance, Mrs. Finch's distracted attention. Each was a brushstroke in a larger portrait, a portrait that she knew would eventually reveal the truth of Henry Calthorpe's death. She picked up her knitting once more, letting her hands move while her mind traced invisible connections. Outside, the bell tower cast a long shadow across the square, still silent, still watching. Miss Marple understood that the next days would bring more revelations, and she intended to be ready, calm and attentive, for each subtle whisper of truth. Chapter 13. A Hint of Deception. Thursday morning brought a crisp chill to Rosehill, and the village awoke beneath a pale sun that glinted off the cobbles with a frosty gleam. Miss Marple, shawl fastened tightly, decided it was time to pay another visit to the tower. She did not intend to climb it, that would be for the authorities, but she wished to inspect the surrounding grounds quietly. Near the lich gate she noticed something new, a small scrap of paper partially tucked beneath a stone. She picked it up delicately, unfolding it to reveal a short, scrawled note. "Meet me at dusk. No one must know." The handwriting was hurried, the ink slightly smeared from recent rain. Miss Marple tucked the note into her pocket. A rendezvous at dusk suggested clandestine meetings. Perhaps someone trying to warn Calthorpe, or perhaps someone luring him. Later that morning, she visited Mr. Ellison under the pretense of inquiring about him arrangements. She mentioned casually the note she had found near the tower, leaving the paper in her pocket for effect. The verger paled almost imperceptibly. "Notes can mislead, Miss Marple," he said hastily. "Perhaps it was a child's prank. You know how children amuse themselves." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "though it seems rather an elaborate prank for a child." She watched his reaction carefully. The tremor in his hands returned as he fussed with a hymn book. Something about his agitation did not seem consistent with mere nervousness over a child's mischief. By midday she walked to the Green Hart Inn, where Mr. Brewer was now visibly recovering but still cautious. She mentioned, almost casually, that a certain London man had asked about the lane behind the churchyard and the mill bend. Brewer's face tightened, and he cast a quick glance toward the door as if expecting someone to appear. Miss Marple continued her quiet inquiries throughout the afternoon, noting small reactions. Lily Ellison seemed to linger longer than necessary at the post office, while Mrs. Markham arrived briefly to inquire about village news, her eyes scanning for signs of interest or panic. As dusk fell, Miss Marple returned to the tower path. The lane was deserted, and the air held a chill that raised gooseflesh on her arms. She noticed footprints in the soft earth, the same boot prints she had observed earlier, but now accompanied by lighter, hurried marks, suggesting someone had returned recently and in a hurry. Standing in the shadow of the tower, Miss Marple considered her notes. The pattern was emerging. Someone in the village had secret knowledge of Calthorpe's arrival and intentions. Someone had moved in the shadows to manipulate or perhaps endanger him. Returning home, she sat by the window, lamp alight, knitting idle stitches while her mind worked at full speed. A suspect was beginning to take shape in her thoughts, a person whose small gestures, nervous evasion, and proximity to key events could no longer be ignored. Yet Miss Marple remained calm. She knew better than to jump to conclusions. The threads were assembling. Soon, they would reveal the tapestry of deception that had enveloped Rosehill. Chapter 14. Subtle Tests. Friday morning in Rosehill was bright but sharp, the kind of crisp light that made shadows appear longer than usual. Miss Marple stepped into the square, her eyes quietly observing every movement. Today, she decided she would begin small tests, subtle provocations to watch how those around the church, the Green Hart, and the village reacted. Her first stop was the Green Hart Inn. Mr. Brewer was behind the counter, cleaning glasses, and he looked more composed than the previous week. Miss Marple commented lightly on the fine cider he had brewed recently, then asked, almost in passing, "Do you ever notice anything unusual near the churchyard, Brewer? A stranger, perhaps, or late visits at odd hours?" Brewer's hands stilled, the cloth dropping mid-polish. Nothing unusual," he said quickly. His eyes flicked toward the window as though fearing someone might be watching. Miss Marple nodded quietly, storing the reaction. Small inconsistencies like this often revealed far more than direct questions. Next, She visited Mr. Ellison at the vestry. While arranging hymnals, she mentioned, in the gentlest of tones, that she had observed a young woman lingering near the tower. Lily Ellison, of course. "She seems troubled," Miss Marple remarked. "Do you worry for her safety?" Mr. Ellison stiffened, gripping a hymn book a little too tightly. "She is careful," he muttered. "I prefer she keeps to herself when possible." His defensiveness and the shadow of anxiety were exactly the reactions Miss Marple had anticipated. After lunch, she made her way to the post office. Lily was there, sorting letters with trembling fingers. Miss Marple casually referenced a letter she had seen delivered earlier in the week, one addressed to Mrs. Markham. Lily's hands froze, and her eyes darted toward the clock. She murmured something about errands and hurried off, leaving Miss Marple to note the sudden, anxious movement. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the lane behind the church and examined the faint boot and tire tracks again. The pattern of comings and goings was becoming clearer. Someone had moved purposefully in and around the churchyard, perhaps hoping to conceal visits to the belfry. The small evidence of human presence, prints, disturbed leaves, minor scraps of paper, gave her a growing sense of the rhythm of events. As evening drew near, she returned home, sat by her lamp, and compiled her observations. Each reaction she had provoked, each subtle test she had set, confirmed a growing suspicion. Someone in Rosehill was guarding a secret, one that related to Henry Calthorpe's arrival and death. The threads were weaving together, faintly at first, like the beginning of a pattern in a tapestry, but steadily taking shape. The bell tower, silent in the gathering dusk, seemed to watch her as she reflected. Miss Marple's calm demeanor belied the intensity of her attention. In the days to come, she would press her tests further, observing, listening, and waiting for the smallest sign, the moment when truth could no longer hide behind polite smiles and careful evasions. Chapter 15. A Key Discovery. Saturday morning in Rosehill was still and golden, the kind of light that glinted off dew-soaked cobbles and made the shadows of the bell tower long and sharp. Miss Marple, finishing her early breakfast, decided it was time to return to the scene of the first murder, the church tower. She did not intend to disturb the police investigation, but careful observation could reveal details overlooked by others. Near the base of the tower, she noticed a small indentation in the soil, partially obscured by fallen leaves. Bending down, she examined it closely. A footprint larger than Mr. Ellison's, pressed firmly in the earth, with the unmistakable tread of a heavy boot. She noted its direction, toward the mill path, away from the churchyard. Alongside it lay a thin scrap of fabric, dark and frayed at the edges. Miss Marple held it delicately with her handkerchief. The material was rough, not uncommon, but its placement suggested a struggle, or a hurried attempt to conceal something. Someone had been here after Calthorpe's death, either trying to tamper with evidence or to retrieve a hidden item. Later that morning, she paid a discreet visit to Mr. Brewer at the Green Hart. She asked casually about his health and his morning routines. Brewer's hands fidgeted, and he seemed reluctant to meet her eyes when she mentioned the lane near the church. Miss Marple, serene and patient, merely noted it, saying, "I understand the body of the village must have its own rhythm, Mr. Brewer. Sometimes small accidents happen when one moves in shadows." By midday, she decided to visit Mrs. Markham. The widow received her with practiced grace, but Miss Marple noticed the slight twitch of her hand when the subject of the tower came up. Miss Marple asked about any letters or messages Mrs. Markham had received recently, particularly those involving Henry Calthorpe. The widow answered calmly, but her eyes flickered, betraying a touch of unease. The afternoon was spent walking quietly through the village lanes. Miss Marple examined the footprints again, noting their direction and approximate size, and considered the small scrap of fabric. These were subtle clues, but to a careful observer, they suggested the killer was someone used to moving discreetly around the churchyard, familiar with its paths and timing. As dusk approached, she returned home, lamp alight and notebook open. She laid out her observations. The footprint and frayed fabric near the tower. Brewer's nervous reaction to her casual questioning. Mrs. Markham's fleeting hesitation when discussing messages from Calthorpe. Lily Ellison's constant anxiety and sudden movements. Miss Marple felt the threads converging. The killer was likely someone local, intimately familiar with the village and the tower. Someone who had both motive and the nerve to act under the cover of ordinary routines. Sitting by the window, watching the bell tower silhouette against a violet sky, Miss Marple knew the next step was crucial. She would need to test her suspicion carefully, to provoke a reaction subtle enough to reveal truth without alerting the guilty party. The calm of Rosehill, so deceptive in daylight, now seemed fragile, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, serene and composed, prepared for the revelations that were certain to follow. Chapter 16. A deliberate provocation. Sunday morning brought soft mist to Rosehill, curling around hedgerows and cloaking the cobbles in silver haze. Miss Marple, shawl pinned neatly, walked toward the village square with her usual measured pace. Today, she planned a subtle experiment, a small, deliberate provocation to observe how the villagers reacted, without revealing her knowledge or suspicion. Her first stop was the Green Hart Inn. Brewer, pale but recovering, busied himself with cleaning tankards. Miss Marple commented casually, "I noticed yesterday, Mr. Brewer, some footprints near the tower path seemed unusually fresh. Curious, isn't it, how one might wander without being seen?" Brewer froze, a hand resting on a tankard, and his eyes flicked nervously to the window. I wasn't aware," he stammered. "Could be anyone walking by." Miss Marple nodded serenely. "Of course. It's amazing how quickly the village paths record our comings and goings." She said nothing further, simply observing his reactions with the quiet patience of someone accustomed to human subtlety. Later she strolled past the churchyard. Lily Ellison was there, tidying flowers on a grave. Miss Marple, in a casual tone, mentioned that she had seen the girl near the tower on more than one occasion. Lily's hands trembled slightly, and her gaze darted toward the belfry before she murmured, "Just taking care, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled faintly and moved on, taking mental note of the reactions. Each twitch, each glance away, each faltering word was like a brushstroke on a canvas that gradually revealed the picture beneath the surface. By afternoon, she visited Mrs. Markham, offering tea and conversation in her parlor. During casual talk, she remarked on Henry Calthorpe's inquiries and the strange events of the past week. Mrs. Markham's fingers tightened around her teacup, and her eyes flicked toward the window as if measuring distance to the tower. "All these coincidences," Miss Marple said gently, "are remarkable, aren't they? So many small actions that seem ordinary, yet together they tell a story." The widow's lips pressed tightly together, but she said nothing, offering only a polite nod. Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger, storing the detail in her mind. As dusk fell, Miss Marple returned home, reviewing the day's reactions. Brewer's nervous glance and halted speech. Lily Ellison's trembling hands and avoidance of direct answers. Mrs. Markham's tense gestures and fleeting unease. Sitting by her lamp, knitting idle stitches, Miss Marple realized that her subtle tests had begun to bear fruit. The guilty party was likely someone among these villagers, familiar with the churchyard, observant of others' movements, and careful to hide small truths. Outside, the bell tower stood tall against the violet sky, silent but watchful. Miss Marple, calm yet intensely attentive, understood that the coming days would demand even more delicate observation. The trap had been set. Soon, the responses would reveal the final strands of the hidden story. Chapter 17. A reaction that speaks. Monday arrived with a silvery drizzle, softening the edges of Rosehill and muffling the usual clatter of carts and footsteps. Miss Marple, moving quietly along the square, sensed that the calm of the village was growing taut, like a thread stretched too far. Her subtle provocations of the previous day had begun to unsettle the guilty, and today she intended to observe carefully for the slightest confirmation. Her first stop was the Green Hart Inn. Brewer was tending the fire, polishing glasses with an air of distracted attention. Miss Marple made a light remark about the footprints near the tower path, nothing more than a casual comment, and watched him closely. Brewer's hand trembled as he set down the glass, and he gave a quick glance toward the rear door as if expecting someone to appear. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than to him. "How our movements can betray us, even when we believe ourselves hidden." Brewer's eyes widened slightly, a small but unmistakable flicker of fear. Miss Marple noted the response but did not press further, knowing that patience would yield more than confrontation. Later, she walked along the lane behind the churchyard, where Lily Ellison was placing flowers near the wall. Miss Marple remarked on how the lane could be treacherous after rain, mentioning casually that she had noticed fresh prints along the path. Lily's hand shook visibly, and she dropped a small envelope she had been clutching. "Oh," she exclaimed, hastily picking it up. I didn't see you there." Miss Marple smiled gently. "People often hide what they believe to be secrets, my dear. But the earth and the leaves remember what we do." Lily said nothing further and hurried away, leaving Miss Marple to note the peculiar urgency in her retreat. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Markham, ostensibly to discuss village news. She mentioned that she had been examining the area near the tower and had seen traces of someone moving there after dusk. The widow's composure wavered for just a moment. Her fingers tightened on her teacup, and her gaze shifted rapidly toward the window. Miss Marple's eyes, calm but penetrating, caught the flicker of unease. "Even the most careful can be betrayed by small things," she observed. Returning home at dusk, she reflected on the day. Brewer's fear, Lily's trembling, Mrs. Markham's fleeting lapse. Each reaction, when considered together, created a clearer picture. Someone in Rosehill had been deeply involved with Henry Calthorpe's death, and the subtle disturbances she had introduced were beginning to force cracks in their careful facades. Miss Marple sat by the lamp, knitting idly, her mind working through the patterns. The culprit was still hidden, yet the first confirming reactions had appeared. Patience and quiet observation would now do the rest, revealing the final threads of the hidden story. Outside, the bell tower loomed against the violet sky, silent and imposing. Miss Marple, serene and attentive, understood that the village's quiet was deceptive, and that the moment of revelation was drawing ever closer. Chapter 18. The Subtle Confrontation. Tuesday morning in Rosehill arrived pale and still, the mist lingering in the hedgerows like a whispered secret. Miss Marple, shawl pinned neatly, set out for her walk with a measured pace, her mind carefully arranging the threads she had gathered over the past weeks. Today, she planned a deliberate but subtle confrontation. Not to accuse, but to observe, to see how the suspect reacted under gentle scrutiny. Her first stop was the Green Hart Inn, where Brewer stood behind the counter, tidying glasses. Miss Marple made a light comment about the strange events of the week: the tower, the London stranger, and the curious footprints she had noticed along the lane. Brewer's hands trembled slightly, and his eyes flicked to the rear door as if expecting an unseen presence. "You see, Mr. Brewer," she said softly, "even a quiet village has its secrets, and people often reveal them without knowing it." Brewer flushed, a subtle twitch in his jaw betraying inner agitation. He mumbled something about being busy, and quickly turned to fetch a clean towel from the shelf. Miss Marple's eyes followed him with calm intensity, storing every detail. Later, she strolled past the churchyard, where Lily Ellison was tending a small cluster of flowers near the wall. Miss Marple commented on how easy it was to misstep along the wet cobbles, casually noting the recent prints she had observed. Lily's hand shook, and she clutched a small envelope so tightly that her knuckles whitened. "Oh, I didn't see you there," she exclaimed, hastily gathering the letter. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Even the smallest gestures can betray what we wish to hide, my dear. The earth and the leaves remember what we do." Lily hurried away, leaving Miss Marple to consider her reaction carefully. By mid-afternoon, she visited Mrs. Markham, ostensibly to discuss village news. During conversation, Miss Marple referenced Calthorpe's inquiries and the unusual occurrences around the tower. Mrs. Markham's composure faltered for a brief moment. Her fingers tightened around her teacup, and her eyes darted toward the window. "Even the most careful can be betrayed by little things," Miss Marple observed gently, her voice calm and even. Returning home in the soft evening light, Miss Marple reflected on the day's observations. Brewer's subtle fear, Lily's trembling hands, Mrs. Markham's fleeting unease. Each reaction fit into a pattern that pointed to a hidden hand guiding events in Rosehill. Sitting by her lamp, knitting idle stitches, Miss Marple realized that the moment of revelation was approaching. The threads were almost aligned, and the quiet village was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to surface. Outside, the bell tower stood in silhouette against the violet sky, silent yet imposing. Miss Marple, serene and attentive, understood that the coming days would require patience, keen observation, and subtle testing. All the skills that had made her so effective in uncovering the secrets of human nature. Chapter 19. A Slip in the Shadows. Wednesday evening descended slowly over Rosehill, the sky streaked with pale amber fading into violet. The village was quiet, the usual bustle replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant tolling of a church bell, though St. Ethelrita's remained silent. Miss Marple, shawl neatly fastened, set out for her habitual walk along the lane behind the churchyard. She intended to observe, to let the suspect reveal themselves through ordinary movements. Near the mill path, she noticed faint footprints in the damp earth, the same heavy tread she had traced before. Someone had been there recently, their passage deliberate but anxious. As she followed the tracks quietly, she saw a figure emerge from the shadows, Mr. Brewer moving briskly, glancing over his shoulder as if fearing someone behind him. Miss Marple stepped lightly from the hedge and spoke, her tone calm and neutral. "Good evening, Mr. Brewer. I didn't expect to see anyone so late." Brewer stopped abruptly, his hand frozen on the gatepost. I was just checking the mill path," he stammered. His voice trembled, betraying nerves he could not conceal. "You've been here before, haven't you?" Miss Marple asked softly, knitting her words with calm authority. "It seems this path attracts you more often than others." Brewer swallowed hard, his eyes flicking nervously to the church tower. I didn't mean anything. I was just walking," he muttered. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Curious how our movements can betray us, Mr. Brewer. Even small actions speak when words are careful." At that, Brewer's composure broke, a subtle shake of his head, a quick exhale, and the admission came almost unconsciously. I wanted to see if someone was leaving notes. I thought, perhaps it was connected to Calthorpe's death." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Ah, so you were searching for something you feared might be hidden. That is understandable. And yet, in doing so, you reveal more than you intend." The confession, slight as it was, confirmed a growing pattern. Brewer's nervousness, his repeated presence near the tower, and the recent slips in conversation all pointed toward knowledge of the crime. While he was not yet directly implicated, his behavior revealed that he was entangled in the events more deeply than he had admitted. Miss Marple left him standing near the path, calm as ever, her mind quietly arranging the details. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. The suspect had begun to reveal the truth without coercion. Observation, subtle provocation, and patience had brought the hidden strands to the surface. Returning home, she reflected on the day. The puzzle was no longer merely a tangle of small incidents. The pattern was emerging clearly. With careful strategy, she would be able to lead the final pieces into place, and soon the true culprit behind Henry Calthorpe's death would be revealed. Outside, the bell tower stood silhouetted against the fading light, silent yet imposing. Rosehill, calm as it appeared, was now on the brink of discovery, and Miss Marple, serene and insightful, was ready to witness it unfold. Chapter 20. The Final Preparation. Thursday morning dawned with a crisp clarity, the kind that sharpened the edges of every roof, hedge, and cobblestone in Rosehill. Miss Marple, shawl firmly pinned and notebook in hand, spent the early hours quietly reviewing her observations. Every reaction, every subtle slip from the past days, was catalogued and measured. Today, she decided, it was time to set her final test. Her plan was simple but delicate: to create a situation that would make the culprit reveal themselves through instinctive behavior, without direct confrontation. She began by sending subtle invitations to key villagers, a tea gathering at her cottage that afternoon, framed as an ordinary social visit. Brewer, Lily Ellison, and Mrs. Markham all received their invitations. The wording was casual, friendly, entirely unremarkable, but it would be enough to draw them into her quiet web of observation. By mid-morning she prepared her parlor. Chairs were placed strategically, the tea table arranged to encourage conversation, and small items subtly positioned to test reactions. A ledger, a scrap of paper, and a partially folded letter, innocuous to any casual observer, were deliberately placed where she knew only the guilty would notice and react. When the guests arrived, Miss Marple greeted them warmly, her calm demeanor putting everyone at ease. Tea was poured, scones offered, and polite conversation began. She asked light questions about the village, the churchyard, and recent events. Nothing direct, nothing accusatory. Yet each question was carefully crafted to allow reactions to surface. Miss Marple observed quietly. Brewer's gaze lingered on the folded letter, his fingers twitching as if tempted to reach for it. Lily's hands fidgeted, the slightest tremor betraying tension. Mrs. Markham maintained her composure, but her eyes darted repeatedly toward the ledger, the faintest flush rising in her cheeks. Miss Marple spoke softly, drawing attention to minor inconsistencies in the village gossip, mentioning footprints near the churchyard, and the curious movements of certain villagers at dusk. She watched carefully as each individual responded. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a shift of weight, a glance away, a hand curling instinctively around a cup. Each movement, each micro-expression, revealed more than words ever could. Miss Marple's patience paid off. The guilty party's instincts betrayed them, their reactions an involuntary confession to the observant eye. By the end of the gathering, Miss Marple had what she needed. She allowed the conversation to drift back to neutral topics, concealing her knowledge, and made notes discreetly. The pattern was complete. The strand she had been following for weeks now converged, and the final revelation was within reach. Sitting by her lamp that evening, she reflected calmly on the events of the day. Rosehill had held its secrets tightly, but human nature, as she knew well, could not resist exposure forever. Soon, she thought, the true story behind Henry Calthorpe's death would emerge, and justice, in the quiet, precise way only Miss Marple could orchestrate, would be served. Outside, the bell tower cast its long shadow across the square. Silent, looming, and indifferent, it watched as Miss Marple prepared for the moment when truth would finally pierce the village's serene facade.